May 1943. A convoy of vehicles winds through the countryside of North London, past rolling green hills and ancient oak trees, carrying some of the most dangerous men in the Third Reich. Inside sit General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commander of Army Group Africa, and his senior staff officers, men who had commanded tens of thousands of troops in Tunisia, men who had stood face to face with Rommel himself. Just days earlier, von Arnim had personally overseen the destruction of his own tanks before surrendering to British forces on the dusty plains of Cap Bon. The Tunisia campaign had ended in catastrophe. Over 275,000 Axis soldiers captured, an entire army group annihilated. Now, stripped of command, but not of dignity, von Arnim expects the standard fate of a captured general: a stark prison camp, endless interrogations under harsh lights, perhaps solitary confinement. Instead, the convoy pulls through iron gates and up a sweeping gravel drive. Before the German officers stands Trent Park, a magnificent English country estate that once hosted King Edward VIII and Charlie Chaplin. The mansion's grand facade gleams in the spring sunlight, its manicured gardens stretching toward ancient woodlands. Sir Philip Sassoon, the aristocratic politician and socialite who had owned the estate until his death in 1939, had transformed Trent Park into one of England's most glamorous addresses. Now it would serve a very different purpose. A figure in immaculate civilian dress approaches with a warm smile. He introduces himself as Lord Aberfeldy, second cousin to King George VI himself, and welcomes the generals as honored guests. His Majesty, he explains, has personally ordered that officers of their distinguished rank be treated according to their status as military gentlemen. Von Arnim and his officers exchange bewildered glances. This cannot be real. This must be some elaborate British trick. But as they are shown to spacious private rooms with adjoining sitting areas, as they discover the billiard tables and card rooms waiting for their leisure, as servants offer whiskey and cigars, the confusion deepens into something approaching comfort. Perhaps, they begin to think, these British are simply too civilized, or too stupid, to understand the realities of modern warfare. They could not have been more wrong. What none of these battle-hardened commanders could possibly know was that every word they spoke, every whispered confidence, every unguarded boast about the fatherland's secret weapons and military conquests was being captured by hidden microphones embedded in the walls, the furniture, the light fixtures, even the trees in the garden. Deep in the basement of this genteel mansion, a hidden army of listeners recorded their every conversation onto acetate discs, transcribed them into detailed intelligence reports, and fed the information to the highest levels of British military command. The generals believed they had outsmarted their captors. In truth, they had walked into the most sophisticated intelligence trap of the Second World War. The mastermind behind this extraordinary deception was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Joseph Kendrick, a 58-year-old career intelligence officer who had already spent nearly 3 decades serving the British Secret Service. Kendrick was not the type of spy who inspired Hollywood films. He was quiet, meticulous, and possessed what colleagues described as an almost preternatural ability to understand how the German mind worked. That understanding had been forged through years of experience running agent networks from Vienna, where he had operated undercover as a British passport officer throughout the 1920s and 1930s. When war erupted in September 1939, Kendrick received orders that would change the course of intelligence history. He was to establish a new kind of interrogation facility, one that would extract secrets from German prisoners without them ever knowing they had revealed anything at all. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than subjecting prisoners to harsh questioning that might produce false information, Kendrick would create conditions so comfortable that prisoners would let their guard down and speak freely among themselves. The operation began in the most unlikely location imaginable, the Tower of London. Within the ancient fortress's thick stone walls, Kendrick's team installed primitive listening equipment in the cells holding captured German U-boat crews. The results were immediate and remarkable. Believing their interrogations were over, the sailors returned to their cells and boasted to their fellow prisoners about what they had cleverly withheld from their British captors. They discussed U-boat tactics, technological innovations, and the unbreakable Enigma codes, never suspecting that every word was being recorded. One early transcript captured a German sailor tapping on the wall to alert his neighbor in the next cell. He had found a microphone, he warned, hidden above the fireplace. The British held their breath. But the security-conscious prisoner was simply transferred to another camp, and no rumors spread. The deception held. Within weeks, Kendrick knew he had stumbled upon an intelligence goldmine. By the end of September 1939, he had 60 German prisoners in the tower, and the flow of intelligence was already proving more valuable than anything traditional interrogation could produce. As the war intensified and the number of high-value prisoners grew, Kendrick requisitioned Trent Park, a grand estate that had belonged to the wealthy Sassoon family before Sir Philip Sassoon's death in 1939. Over the following months, his team transformed the mansion into a state-of-the-art surveillance center. Specialized engineers threaded thousands of meters of lead-lined wiring through the walls, behind skirting boards, under floorboards, and into every conceivable hiding place. They embedded miniature RCA microphones in light fittings, fireplaces, plant pots, and window ledges. They even wired the billiard table and placed listening devices in the benches and trees throughout the garden. The cover name for the operation was CSDIC, Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, but those who worked there knew it simply as the M Room operation. The M stood for mic'd. What made Trent Park truly remarkable was not just its technical sophistication, but the elaborate theatrical production that Kendrick constructed around it. Every detail was designed to make the German prisoners feel comfortable, important, and utterly secure in their privacy. The fictitious Lord Aberfeldy was the centerpiece of this performance. In reality, there was no such title in the British peerage. The role was played by Ian Munro, a military intelligence officer with an actor's gift for convincing aristocratic bearing. Munro told the generals that King George VI himself had taken a personal interest in their welfare, a claim that appealed directly to their sense of importance and their expectation that officers of their rank deserved special treatment. He arranged for visiting tailors to press and maintain their uniforms, ensuring they could maintain the dignity of their rank. He organized the stocking of a full German library with books borrowed from the abandoned German embassy in London. He even escorted groups of generals on supervised excursions to exclusive London establishments, Harrods, the Savoy Hotel, Simpson's on the Strand, where they could enjoy the finest British hospitality while unwittingly providing Kendrick's officers with fresh material for observation. The trips to London served multiple purposes. They reinforced the illusion of privileged treatment, encouraged the generals to let their guard down, and created opportunities for intelligence officers to observe their subjects in social settings. The generals would return to Trent Park full of conversation about their outings, comparing impressions and gossip, all of it captured by the waiting microphones. The psychological manipulation was exquisite. Kendrick understood that men accustomed to command needed to feel they remained figures of consequence. By treating them as military gentlemen rather than defeated enemies, he stripped away their defensive instincts. The generals quickly established their own internal hierarchy, with von Arnim serving as the appointed camp leader. They organized themselves into discussion groups, held debates about strategy and politics, and, most valuably for British intelligence, argued openly about who bore responsibility for Germany's military failures. But Kendrick did not rely solely on comfort to loosen tongues. He also deployed carefully selected stool pigeons, undercover operatives who infiltrated the prisoner community. Some posed as captured German officers with impeccable credentials. Others played sympathetic British aristocrats with professed Nazi sympathies. These agents steered conversations toward sensitive topics, dropped provocative hints about military developments, and created opportunities for the generals to demonstrate their superior knowledge. One particularly clever technique involved leaving partially faked newspapers where the generals would find them. A story would appear from a fictitious Swedish correspondent mentioning vague reports of rocket testing in the Baltic region. The generals, eager to discuss something they actually knew about, would pounce on the article. Their subsequent conversations, captured in full by the basement listeners, provided exactly the kind of confirmation that British intelligence desperately needed. The daily routine at Trent Park was designed to maximize opportunities for recorded conversation. After breakfast, the generals might attend language classes or art sessions, seemingly innocent activities that gave them time to talk. Afternoons might find them playing table tennis or cards, always within range of hidden microphones. In the evenings, they gathered in the common rooms, sipping whiskey provided by their generous hosts, and spoke freely about everything from their contempt for Hitler's military decisions to their first-hand knowledge of atrocities on the Eastern Front. As one of the generals later wrote, captured in his own recorded words, the British seemed too stupid to have bugged the premises. It was exactly what Kendrick wanted them to believe. Hidden in the basement of Trent Park, working in cramped rooms that the generals never knew existed, sat the true heroes of the operation, the secret listeners. These men and women operated in squads of 6, working 2 shifts from 8 a.m. until the last prisoner retired for the evening. They wore headphones connected to the network of hidden microphones throughout the mansion, recording conversations onto blank acetate discs that could capture up to 7 minutes of audio at a time. The work was painstaking and emotionally grueling. Listeners had to be fluent in German, not just standard German, but the full range of regional dialects that the generals spoke. They needed to understand military terminology, technical jargon, and the subtle implications of casual conversation. and they had to maintain absolute concentration for hours at a time, knowing that a single missed phrase might mean losing intelligence that could save thousands of lives. Remarkably, many of the secret listeners were German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. Men like Erich Mark, born Erich Meyer in Magdeburg, who had been sent to Britain by his parents in 1935 to escape the growing horror. Erich joined the Pioneer Corps and later transferred to the Intelligence Corps, eventually being posted to Trent Park for listening duties. His parents were not so fortunate. They were sent to Treblinka concentration camp and did not survive. Imagine the psychological burden these listeners carried. They sat in darkened basement rooms, transcribing conversations between the very military commanders whose armies had destroyed their families, their communities, their entire world. They heard generals discuss the Holocaust in casual, almost clinical terms. They recorded admissions of war crimes, descriptions of mass shootings, references to the liquidation of Jewish populations, all spoken by men who believed no one outside their circle could hear them. The listeners were forbidden from revealing their existence to anyone. They had signed the Official Secrets Act, and most would go to their graves never telling their families what they had done during the war. Fritz Lustig, one of the surviving secret listeners who lived to see the files declassified in the late 1990s, later described the extraordinary discipline required. He and his colleagues would monitor the generals day after day, year after year, knowing that any slip, any hint that the mansion was wired, would destroy the entire operation. When the listeners recorded conversations about atrocities, they marked the acetate discs with a large red A for atrocity and preserved them in a special archive. Kendrick was determined that the evidence they gathered might someday help bring war criminals to justice. The transcribed drafts were checked by another operative, logged as official reports, and passed to on-site interrogators. An editorial section translated everything into English, with both German and English versions typed up for distribution to key intelligence agencies across Whitehall. By the war's end, this painstaking process had produced more than 100,000 transcripts, a staggering archive of unguarded conversation that would take historians decades to fully analyze. Of all the intelligence gathered at Trent Park, none proved more immediately valuable than the conversations about Hitler's secret weapons program. Since November 1939, British intelligence had received scattered reports about German rocket development, but the information was fragmentary and contradictory. Some officials, including Churchill's own scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, believed the entire rocket program might be an elaborate German hoax designed to distract Allied bombing from other targets. The truth would emerge not from reconnaissance aircraft or captured documents, but from a conversation between two generals who believed themselves completely alone. In late 1942, General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma arrived at Trent Park after his capture at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Von Thoma was a complex figure, a decorated veteran who had commanded the Africa Corps, but privately held deep reservations about the Nazi regime. What made him invaluable to British intelligence was not his opposition to Hitler, but his loose tongue and his extraordinary first-hand knowledge of German weapons development. In conversations recorded by the basement listeners in early 1943, von Thoma spoke with General Ludwig Kruvel about a visit he had made to a secret facility at Kummersdorf West, accompanied by Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army. Von Thoma described huge things being tested there, rockets that would travel 15 kilometers into the stratosphere before descending on their targets. "You only aim at an area," he explained, suggesting a weapon of mass terror rather than precision. The major at the facility, von Thoma recalled, was full of hope about what these weapons would accomplish. This was the confirmation British intelligence needed, combined with other fragments of evidence, reports from Polish resistance fighters, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and information smuggled out by forced laborers. The Trent Park transcripts established beyond doubt that Germany was developing weapons that could change the course of the war. On June 29, 1943, Churchill's War Cabinet Defense Committee met to review the evidence. Duncan Sandys, Churchill's son-in-law and the officer responsible for investigating the rocket threat, presented aerial photographs that showed unmistakable rocket shapes at a facility on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. Despite Lord Cherwell's continued skepticism, the evidence was now overwhelming. Churchill made the decision personally. Peenemünde must be destroyed, and the attack must be conducted at the heaviest possible scale. On the night of August 17–18, 1943, 596 RAF bombers took off for Operation Hydra, the most concentrated attack on a single target in the war to date. The raid employed a new technique. For the first time, a master bomber coordinated the attack in real time from the air, directing successive waves onto their designated targets. The primary objective was not the facilities themselves, but the scientists and engineers who operated them. The bombers targeted living quarters, research buildings, and production facilities in sequence. The attack killed approximately 170 German personnel, including 2 key rocket scientists. More importantly, it forced the Germans to disperse their entire V-weapon program, relocating development to Poland and production to underground facilities in the Harz Mountains. Estimates vary, but most historians believe Operation Hydra delayed the deployment of the V-2 rocket by somewhere between 2 and 6 months, months that proved decisive. The first V-1 flying bomb did not strike London until June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day. Had the weapons program proceeded on its original schedule, London might have been under rocket bombardment during the critical planning stages for the Normandy invasion. As Lieutenant Colonel Leo St. Clair Grondona, Kendrick's deputy, later wrote, "Had it not been for the information obtained at these centers, it could have been London, and not Hiroshima, which was devastated by the first atomic bomb." The V-weapon intelligence was only the beginning. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, the secret listeners continued to harvest invaluable information from their unwitting sources. They learned about German U-boat tactics, including details of newly invented torpedoes that could sense the magnetic fields of British ships, intelligence that allowed the Admiralty to develop protective countermeasures that saved countless vessels and crews. They gathered information about German aircraft capabilities, including the strengths and weaknesses of Luftwaffe fighters that proved critical during the Battle of Britain and beyond. The listeners also documented the deepening fractures within the German High Command. After the July 1944 attempt on Hitler's life, Operation Valkyrie, the generals at Trent Park reacted with a mixture of shock, horror, and in some cases, barely concealed approval. The recordings captured their aghast conversations about Hitler's bloody revenge against the conspirators, their private doubts about Germany's ability to win the war, and their increasingly bitter recriminations about who bore responsibility for the disaster unfolding on all fronts. When news of Hitler's suicide reached Trent Park in late April 1945, the listeners recorded the general's reaction with clinical precision. There were no tears, no expressions of grief. Some generals clinked wine glasses on VE Day, a gesture that horrified their orderlies, but revealed everything about how far these men had traveled from their original loyalty to the Third Reich. The walls had captured the full arc of their psychological journey, from confident boasts to bitter defeat. Perhaps the most disturbing intelligence gathered at Trent Park had nothing to do with weapons or military strategy. In the wood-paneled rooms of the English mansion, German generals spoke with chilling candor about their knowledge of, and in some cases participation in, the Holocaust and other war crimes. General Dietrich von Choltitz arrived at Trent Park in late 1944 after surrendering Paris to the Allies. He was widely praised for having defied Hitler's direct order to destroy the French capital, a decision that earned him a measure of respect even among his captors. But in private conversation with his fellow prisoners, von Choltitz revealed a very different history. The hidden microphones captured him describing his service on the Eastern Front. The worst job I ever carried out, which, however, I carried out with great consistency, was the liquidation of the Jews. I carried out this order down to the very last detail. The words were chilling in their matter-of-factness. Von Choltitz was not confessing with horror or remorse. He was rehearsing the defense that many German officers would later offer at Nuremberg. They were simply obeying orders. In October 1944, the listeners recorded another devastating admission. Von Choltitz spoke to General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma about the broader guilt of the German officer corps. "We all share the guilt. We went along with everything, and we half took the Nazis seriously, instead of saying, 'To hell with you,' and 'Your stupid nonsense.' I misled my soldiers into believing this rubbish. I feel utterly ashamed of myself. Perhaps we bear even more guilt than these uneducated animals." Similar conversations echoed throughout the mansion's bugged rooms. General Edwin Graf von Rothkirch und Trach described his time in the Polish town of Kutno, where an SS officer had casually invited him to witness a mass execution. "I knew an SS leader pretty well, and we talked about this and that, and one day he said, 'Listen, if you ever want to film one of these shootings, I mean, it doesn't really matter. These people are always shot in the morning. If you're interested, we still have a few left over, and we could also shoot them in the afternoon, if you like.'" General Lieutenant Heinrich Kittel, commander of the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division, told General Major Paul von Felbert about mass executions he had witnessed in Latvia. In Latvia, near Dvinsk, there were mass executions of Jews carried out by the SS. I got up and went outside and said, "What the hell's all this shooting about?" The orderly said to me, "You ought to go over there, sir. You'll see something." 300 men had been driven in from the town. They dug a communal grave, then marched home again. For the German Jewish refugees working as secret listeners, transcribing these accounts must have been almost unbearable. Many would not learn until after the war the full fate of their own families. Yet they continued their work with extraordinary discipline, documenting every admission, preserving every recording, building an archive that would eventually prove, beyond any possible doubt, that the Wehrmacht's senior commanders knew exactly what was happening to the Jews of Europe. The Trent Park transcripts demolished the post-war myth that ordinary German soldiers and officers had been ignorant of the Holocaust. The generals' conversations made clear that knowledge of mass murder was widespread, discussed openly among the military elite, and accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm or distaste, but rarely with active opposition. Yet despite this wealth of evidence, none of the generals held at Trent Park were ever prosecuted for war crimes based on their recorded admissions. The intelligence was considered too valuable to compromise by revealing its source, and in the immediate post-war years, Cold War considerations often outweighed demands for justice. The transcripts were classified and locked away, not to be released until the late 1990s. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the M-Room operation had grown into one of the most significant intelligence achievements in British history. Trent Park was just one of 3 secret sites. Latimer House and Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire processed lower-ranking prisoners, while Trent Park was reserved for the most senior captives. Together, these facilities had bugged the conversations of more than 10,000 German prisoners of war. At Trent Park alone, 84 generals and dozens of senior staff officers had passed through the gilded cage. More than 1,300 protocols, detailed intelligence reports derived from the recorded conversations, were produced before the war's end. The total archive eventually comprised nearly 75,000 transcripts of bugged conversations across all 3 sites. The intelligence gathered fed into virtually every aspect of the Allied war effort. Reports went to MI5, MI6, the Admiralty, the Air Ministry, Bomber Command, and the Political Intelligence Department. The secret listeners provided material to Bletchley Park, where it could be cross-referenced with decoded Enigma communications. They gave interrogators questions to ask and topics to probe. They provided strategic planners with insight into German morale, political divisions, and military capabilities that no other source could offer. In 2017, Historic England formally concluded that Trent Park's wartime work was of considerable national and international historical interest, which bears comparison to the code-breaking work at Bletchley Park. This official recognition, coming more than 7 decades after the war's end, finally acknowledged what those who worked there had always known. The M-Room operation had been one of the war's most important and most closely guarded secrets. The men and women who made it possible had maintained their silence for over half a century. They had signed the Official Secrets Act and honored their commitment even as their health failed and their memories faded. Most went to their graves without ever telling their families about the extraordinary work they had performed. When the files were finally declassified in the late 1990s, only a handful of the original secret listeners remained alive to see their contributions acknowledged. The war ended in May 1945, but the secrets of Trent Park remained locked away for more than half a century. The men and women who had worked there, the listeners, the interrogators, the analysts, had signed the Official Secrets Act, and they honored that commitment with remarkable discipline. They returned to civilian life, built careers, raised families, and went to their graves without ever revealing what they had done during the war. Fritz Lustig, one of the secret listeners, later described the strange duality of his post-war existence. He had spent years transcribing the most sensitive intelligence of the war, listening to German generals discuss everything from rocket weapons to mass murder. Yet he could tell no one, not his wife, not his children, not his colleagues. The secret consumed a part of his identity that could never be shared. When the files were finally declassified in the late 1990s, most of the original participants had already passed away. Only a handful of the secret listeners remained alive to see their contributions acknowledged. They were elderly men and women by then, their memories of those basement rooms fading but never forgotten. For them, the declassification brought a mixture of relief and vindication. The work they had done in silence could finally be recognized. Today, Trent Park stands as a testament to one of history's most elaborate deceptions. After decades serving as a campus for Middlesex University, the mansion underwent restoration and transformation into a museum dedicated to telling the story of the secret listeners. Visitors can walk through the magnificently restored staterooms where German generals once debated Hitler's military decisions, unaware that their every word was being captured. They can descend to the basement, where the secret listeners worked in cramped, hidden rooms, transcribing conversations that would help turn the tide of the war. The original wiring has been discovered throughout the house. Thousands of meters of lead-lined cable running through walls and ceilings, behind skirting boards and under floorboards, a physical testament to the scale and sophistication of the operation. The microphones themselves, tiny RCA devices concealed in every conceivable hiding place, speak to the technical ingenuity that made the deception possible. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Trent Park lies not in the physical artifacts, but in the human stories preserved in its archives. The generals who believed themselves too clever to be fooled, the spy master who understood that the best intelligence comes not from coercion, but from comfort, the Jewish refugees who listened to their enemies describe the destruction of their people, and who continued their work knowing it might help prevent further atrocities. The walls of Trent Park had ears, and what they heard changed history. The intelligence gathered in that English mansion helped delay Hitler's vengeance weapons, informed Allied strategic planning, documented war crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden, and provided an unprecedented window into the minds of Nazi Germany's military elite. It proved that even the most battle-hardened commanders could be deceived by kindness, that the most closely guarded secrets could be surrendered without a single question being asked, and that the pen, or in this case, the hidden microphone, could indeed be mightier than the sword. The German generals who passed through Trent Park believed they had kept their secrets. They were wrong. They had confessed everything to walls that were always listening. If this story of deception, intelligence, and the hidden heroes who helped win the war resonated with you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most compelling stories from military history, the innovations that changed warfare, and the human drama behind the world's greatest conflicts. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next episode, because history always has more secrets to reveal.